Hi everyone. This section of the presentation that I'm going to be doing right now is kind of the completion of the first lesson, the notes that I gave you, and we didn't get them finished in Group A, which was on Monday, or in Group B, which was on Tuesday. We did actually get to different spots on them. So in order for you to kind of be in the right place, I'm starting where I left off with Group B, which is a little earlier in the presentation than it was for the group on Monday. So I'll give you a time that you should start, but it's going to start on the slide that you see here. This is where we left off with the Tuesday group, where we talked about the comparison of the list that you guys made in class, and then the responsibilities that a special ed teacher has, and how the key is going to be collaboration in those cases. So the next thing that I'm just going to briefly review is the idea of the different kinds of models that we use in education. And there could be one more word that I would write on this screen, and that would be after collaboration, I would write mainstream. So let me just quickly explain these different terms. So in a pull-out model, that is where the student is totally out of the classroom, out in the hands of the special ed teacher. So in a pull-out situation, the student becomes the educational responsibility of the pull-out classroom teacher, rather than the responsibility of the general ed classroom teacher. In inclusion, the student is in the general ed classroom. They might be in and out for different things, but generally in inclusion, they're the academic responsibility of the general ed classroom. So if you wanted to make this kind of clear, pull out, they're the property of the SPED teacher. The inclusion, they're the property of the SPED teacher, of the general ed teacher. Now, collaboration, as we kind of were discussing when we looked at our different models, our different responsibilities of gen ed teachers and such, when we took a look at that, we would talk about collaboration where they're really the property of both, that there's responsibilities that both the SPED teacher and the general ed teacher have. Now when it comes to mainstream, a mainstream student has no special education services, so they again would become the property totally of the general ed classroom teacher. So those are some models that we've heard about with special education. Mainstreaming really isn't a model for special education, because when you're mainstreamed, you're no longer getting services. So although we use that term in special education, the student is no longer in need of special ed, and that's why they're being mainstreamed. So this continuum of educational services is a really important graphic for you to understand. And so I'm going to be coming back to it in other presentations and always reminding you of the continuum. A term that we'll talk about in Lesson 2 extensively is something called the least restrictive environment, LRE. And in the world of special education and alphabet soup, that's one of the three, those are three letters that are very important. Least restrictive environment. The goal of least restrictive environment, it's a federally mandated understanding for programming students with special needs, is that the student is put into the classroom, into the setting that is the least restricted for them. So as we take a look at this continuum, and if we start over here on the general ed option 1, if you look at what it says there, it says general education classroom placements with few or no support services. If you take a look at that, then you understand that that student really is getting regular education. There's no special education involved at all. That's the least restricted environment any student could be in, correct? If a student had special ed needs but was in the option 1, they really are being mainstreamed. There's no restrictions on them. So as we move up the continuum, the placements become much more restricted. So that's why we call this a continuum. Now, if you look at the colors that I have on my slide, and you might want to on your notes kind of make a bracket so you understand, from options 1 through 4, you'll notice the setting is always general education. So the student is based on that term alone, under the supervision, under the curriculum instruction and direction of the general ed teacher. The general ed teacher calls the shots, makes the grades, the things that are needed that way. There might be sped teachers involved, but they are not responsible for the giving the grade and communicating with the parents that the gen ed teacher is. So if you look at the least restrictive and you get a little more restricted in the options, by option 4, that student is still in the gen ed classroom, but there might be a para or another teacher sitting there with them. In option 3, they're in the gen ed classroom and they're in there with a speech or language person from time to time. So you can see that they're still always in the gen ed getting support. Now when you get to the next 2 colors, option 5 and 6, you'll notice the color changes, and that's because the placement now becomes special ed. They're in a pull-out classroom where they get part-time support, and when they're in that classroom, that teacher's in charge. When you get into option 6, full-time, they're up completely in special education classroom for their entire day. Now, when you get to the next slide, because the continuum continues, and when you take a look at these options are in another color, because if you notice the settings of these different options, these students are not in a classroom. They're in a specialized school, specialized classroom. So a special school might be for students with just that need, with just that disability. We have some schools like that in the Twin Cities. Groves Academy is one of them that deals with students with dyslexia, reading disabilities. And if you have that and you choose to go there, it's a private setting, they're in that school. You go to a residential school, that's a school just like a special day school, but you live on campus, you live in the dorms there. Homebound is when a student can't leave their home, and so the instruction comes to them, the instructor comes to them instead of them going to school. In situations like this, this isn't just for kids with disabilities or behavior issues. For example, I had a student that was severe, had a leukemia and liver cancer. He had to have a liver transplant when he was about a 5th or 6th grader, and because of the conditions of his transplant and how you can't be exposed to all sorts of different bugs, they had to keep him in a highly controlled environment. Even in his home, he was in almost like a bubble kind of situation, so he couldn't come to school. He had to get his education, though. He continued his education by going online, and we videotaped or live video streamed classes for him in some cases, and in other cases we had the teacher drop off work and worked with him at his house. This can be something that the public school provides as well. And then there are times that kids are hospitalized. In fact, most hospitals, especially on the children ward or in the children's hospitals, you can be hired as a teacher at the hospital where you deliver the curriculum and work with the students on the things that the school is sending for them to do. And I've had students in hospital settings for extended serious illness or mental health issues as well. Okay, so we're going to start getting into special ed law, and we're going to start talking about here, and then lesson 2 we get into the actual legislation that changed special ed. So I think to gain an appreciation for special education, we're going to take a look at the history of where we came with that. This link that I have on this presentation to Wright's Law is a website. And when you can type it in and you can find anything that you need to know about IEPs, 504 plans, all the law is saved there for as a resource for teachers who might need that. But let's go on and let's move into the history. So Itard, we kind of he lived in France, so he wasn't an American psychologist, he was a French psychologist, and we kind of think of him as one of the first special ed people around because he worked with this child, Victor. Victor was found wandering in the woods in France, in the woods of Avignon. He was found undressed. He was as wild as an animal, obviously had been surviving on the land for a while, and so therefore had no socialization skills, no communication skills. And when they found this child, they brought him to Itard, and Itard's goal was to try to normalize him, to give him the skills that he might need to function in society. Now, the child was about, they think, 12 or 13 years old, so there was no way that Itard was going to completely bring him back bring him to the appropriate level of social skills for someone that age, because too much time had gone by. And no one really knows how long the child was in the woods to begin with. He obviously was someone's child, and because of his behaviors and needs, became too much for that family to handle. So they released him into the woods thinking that he would die, and he survived. So he had some, obviously, intelligence. He knew he had the instincts to survive, but he didn't have the skills to survive in society. So Attard was somewhat successful in teaching Victor how to have certain social behaviors. He could appear in public. He could eat with eating utensils, and he had some very basic communication skills, but he was never able to fully function as an adult in society. Edward Seguin is best known from this idea that he came, and again, he was also a French psychologist, and he had this idea that and they called developmental disorders, cognitive disorders at this time, idiocy. It was a precursor term to retardation, and he believed that it was caused by some disorder of the central nervous system, and that if there were certain exercises and sensory exercises and physical exercises, he thought that we could improve the cognitive levels of people. We couldn't change that the fact that the student or the person was cognitively delayed, had mental retardation, but we could improve their lot in life by training them. So he developed this idea that people with severe cognitive disabilities were trainable and could learn vocation and self-care skills. Samuel Howe was an American physician, and his something that you might remember him from is the Perkins School for the Blind. He established that school in New England, and it was first called the New England Institution for the Education of the Blind, but then it became the Perkins School for the Blind. And the other kinds of students went there, schools that were all students that also had cognitive disabilities, but he formed a school and a curriculum to train these children. He is especially known for creating the alphabet for the blind and deaf student, Laura Bridgman, and then that eventually went down to working into American Sign Language as well. So he created a language for these students to use to communicate. He was also an abolitionist and worked hard against slavery during his time, so he's also known for that. So he definitely was a humanitarian. Gaudelet established a school in New England area. He graduated from Yale and studied sign language and European methods for deaf education, and through these two different things, he established a curriculum for teaching students that were deaf. And his first student was Alice Cogswell. She was 9 years old when he started to work with her, but he was able to help her become communicative. And the interesting situation for Gaudelet is that he really his school still exists. The college now exists, and Gaudelet University caters to deaf adults, and their president is also a leader of the institution. Okay, this is kind of where I left off with the first group on Monday, where I talked about this video on deinstitutionalization, and the volume didn't work very well on Monday, so I'm going to run the video again through here, and you'll get a sense of what's going on. Let me just run it, and we'll take it from there.
Back in 1972.
Sorry. Okay, I was trying to make it bigger and that didn't work.
Back in 1972, the Willowbrook State School was the subject of a famous expose by a young reporter looking for his big break.
I first heard of this big place with the pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children. Lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces, they were making a pitiful sound, the kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way